Michelle. Philip, can you hear?
Which is a miracle, by the way.
I love this handheld mic because what I like to do is walk around the room, so maybe we'll get closer. But thank you for having me and for your Michelle for the introduction. I appreciate the invitation from Joyce to be here this morning. I'm grateful for your interest in my book. Frankly, it's not even 8 o'clock. Whenever I hear 163 interviews, I get tired because someone asked me. Well, how long did it take you to write this book? And I said, well, it took me about a year and a half to write the book, with, nights and weekends around my day job. But maybe 3 or 4 years to do the research by way of those interviews. And I talked to some people who are in this room this morning, and you know who you are, and I would like to thank you especially for contributing to my knowledge of the story. And I hope you feel that I have done justice to the story. Someone also asked me before the book came out, I said, well, how long is that book? How many pages is in that book? Well, it turned out about 300 pages. I didn't know the number of pages just yet at that point because the book has to be designed and what size of the pages and the lighting and all that. And they said, well, how many words? I said, well, about 100. I knew that answer because you have to keep track of that. And it's about 100,000 words. And John Brown, I realized at that point, I don't know that many words. So just fair warning, I think I may be repeating myself a little bit, throughout these 300 pages. So thanks again for having me. I want to start out by paying my respects, not only to our elected officials in the room, but to everybody in the room for your service, for coming together as you do in this setting. I come from as I suspect each one of you in this room also has. I come from a family of strong women, and both of my grandmothers were public school teachers. My mother's mother in DeKalb County near Smithville, Tennessee. My father's mother in Jackson County in the Upper Cumberland. You could say near Carthage, but because we all know where Carthage is at this point. But she really came from Granville. Now, if you hadn't been there, Granville is halfway between Chestnut Mound and Flynn's Lick, just so you know. just to kind of split that hair, right? My mother, and forgive me for a little reflection on my mother, she was as Brenda Wynn and Megan know, and Berkeley and I talked about this too. My mother was the first woman elected to the Metro Council in our city. She served. My father had been on the last Nashville City Council and served with Mr. Luby and Judge Willard and other great Nashvillians. And he was actually elected to the first Metro Council. He served almost a full term until he died at a very early age. My mother was a Metro school teacher. And President Burris, I'm sure, I was just a kid, I'm sure, prevailed on her to run. And she did in that special election in November of 1967. And she beat 5 guys without a runoff. Her name was Alice Reeder Hunt, and we lived in the, I think of it, Philip, as the Rosebank School Precinct. So that's where I grew up. I noticed in the morning newspaper today, Tennessean, there was a story on page 1 about politics. If you saw that story, just thank you. What it was about was a poll had been conducted by 2 political consulting firms, Whitares and somebody else, and of over 1,000 Americans, men and women, all ages, 18 and older. And it talked about the career of politics, or willingness to serve in government. to run for public office. And the headline in the top of the story was how respondents under the age of 30 are much less likely to choose politics as a career at this point, for a number of reasons. I'll come back to that. Than they are to choose public service by way of involvement and participation in nonprofit organizations to service the community in that way. And that's commendable, admirable. But knowing I was going to come here this morning and your interest in the political process, whatever your party, and whatever the office, the part of the article that struck me, the story about this research was what it had to say about both young people in one additional respect and also male versus female. For one thing, in terms of all of the respondents, the number of women who were expressing interest in running for political office was in sharp contrast to the number of men. Of course, I guess there are lots of reasons for that, tradition and culture and so forth. That 22% of men were now considering, were saying they would be willing to run for public office, whatever the office, local, state, federal. 22% of men. Women, 8%. And I think in that number lies a great challenge for all of us, because I personally feel we need to have a very strong two-party system, but we also need to have a very strong two-gender system. Our government and our country will be better off if we can move those numbers higher, or that number higher. And that's just sort of a challenge. I think what the work that you're doing in this setting is important. The more people who hear the message about the benefits of public engagement, the better. And we'll see what happens, but I wish you well in what you're doing. The other finding that jumped off the page to me was going back to that group 30 and younger, or rather under 30, of these 1,000+ respondents in the country. It was a very good sample, and the results had a very high confidence level, as we say. And in the group under 30, the respondents, let me go to the group over 30 first. Why wouldn't you consider involvement in public office or seeking a public office yourself in our elective process? The people over 30 said it's just too time-consuming. And I think every elected official in this room would probably identify with the challenge that presents, as well as all of the rest of us who have participated in one way or another in helping somebody run for office. It's very time-consuming. So that's understandable. The respondents under 30 said, when asked why wouldn't you consider doing this? The respondents under 30 said, because the process seems to me to be, quote, too nasty and mean-spirited. Now you read that story, and I would invite you to read the story. Nasty and mean-spirited. And I think we all know what that means and what those words involve now in our current political process. And that, in large part, is why I wrote this book. I wrote this book for two reasons. One is, it struck me for many years as a pretty good tale. It's a pretty good yarn. And I'm a writer, and I love to tell a good story. I grew up working for John Sigenthaler at the National Tennessean, and we were trained, in how to get the facts and tell the story in a compelling way. I like to do that. And this is a pretty good story. So, and certainly having known some of the participants who have been in and around that situation, myself, I knew it was a good story, and it's sort of been in the back of my head for some time. And frankly, this occurred about 35 years ago. We were all babies at that point. I know I was. About 35 years ago, and yet, once you got past, in the research, past the first month or 2 months of the journalism, the news coverage, and then there was ample news coverage in the national papers and television, but also national network TV. And but once you got past that burst of coverage, really not much has been said about this story. And so all of that contributed to my first reason, which was it's a pretty good tale and it needed to be told. And again, I hope if you can read the book, you will feel that we've done it justice. But the other reason goes back to this subject of the sort of nature and tone of our political process today. We don't have to look too far to see stories almost every day of the rancor and what I would call the poisonous atmosphere that prevails, not in every office of it, thank goodness, and not in every legislative body, but certainly when you look at some of our state legislatures, when you look at legislatures, meaning not only Tennessee, but around the country, and certainly in our Congress. There is such rancor and division, there's such an unwillingness to compromise, to come to agreements, to work with a person across the aisle. I happen to believe we are blessed in Nashville to have the Congressman Jim Cooper that we have. Such a wise man, learned. I mean, we kind of joke, but it's true. Jim reads those bills, and then tries to work across party lines. I think our two senators are blessed to have those that we have. And we've seen some examples in the very recent past, this year, where they have helped to create compromise and agreement on very contentious issues, be it immigration reform, whatever, on the Senate side. And that's commendable, and we should hold those examples up. But we have to admit to ourselves, those become, unfortunately, the exceptions in our process today. And so, the reason I thought this book would be relevant, other than just being fun to write and I hope fun to read, was about that. Because I think the hope of our country, really, the hope of our country has to do with the capacity of smart women and men making themselves available for public service and occupying those offices in such a way that we make true progress and that we advance as a city and a state and a nation. Now that's about all the sermon I want to preach this morning, but I think that is such a riveting subject that we really need to have case studies. And we need to have illustrations of how it works. And in this story, which I'll just quickly summarize, we have I think a genuine real-life case study involving flesh and blood people who were very senior partisan people. I mean, there were no more serious Democrats in our country than Ned McCormick and Hal Hardin and John Waller, and Bill Leach, who was our state attorney general. I mean, you have to read the story, but they were true blue. They were yelling off. They were. I can say that because my daddy was one, and my mama was one. But they certainly were. Hal Hardin was the U.S. attorney at the time, appointed by President Carter. There was no more. The chapter that sort of profiles Mr. Hardin, I titled A Man of Great Promise. A Man of Great Promise. There was talk at the time that Hal Hardin might run for governor. And he had a story. He was actually the first judicial appointment of Governor Ray Bland. But he already had a distinguished career as a lawyer in this city. And he was appointed U.S. Attorney by President Carter at a really very young age and was in this position. The story that you will read in Coup is not really so much about the corruption and the trouble. I mean, that had been well documented. You know, what had become of Governor Bland? What had become of his team? Because of the crimes and the investigations and the prosecutions and the convictions. It was not so much about that, although I thought we had to tell enough about that so that a reader 30 years later would understand why this extraordinary day became necessary, why this decision had to be made. What interested me most of all was not the corruption criminal. It was how the decision to remove this governor was made. This had never happened. I mean, I hope everybody here will appreciate it. This had never happened anywhere before in our country, not in any state, and it certainly has never happened since. This is one of the kinds of thing that happened. And so what interested me the most was not the corruption that gave rise to the situation, but how that decision was made in about a 5-hour period on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of January 1979. And who made that decision, and who were those people? Who were those people? The way the decision was made was, somebody might have said, well, you know, coup sounds like it's un-American, and that's what happens in, you know, third world countries and banana republics or whatever. But that's what happened here. It was not violent. It was quiet. It was very quiet. In fact, it was secret. It had to be secret in the opinion of these officials, lest a true public safety emergency occur, because dozens of prisoners were being released. Before this Wednesday morning, 2 nights before that, on Monday, January 15, 1979, the governor had released by his own signature 52 prisoners. 52 prisoners. 23 of them were hardened, serious, I mean, not just murderers. These were vicious murder cases and so forth, and they were released. 52. And one of them, the one that caught the national attention at the time, was Roger Humphreys. You may remember the name Roger Humphreys if you were in Nashville at that time. This was a double murderer from Johnson City, Tennessee. His father had been governor of Blanton's patronage committee, chairman of serious fundraiser for Democrat causes, and an ally of the Blanton crowd. It was his father, and this young man became a very famous story at the time. Leaders of the Democratic Party statewide urged Governor Blanton to recant, to step back from that and not do that. And that was an election year in 1978. 77 leading to the election year in 78. So please don't do this. And we learned that one of the particular appeals came from the Butcher campaign. Jake Butcher, the banker from Knoxville, the Democratic nominee that year for governor, arguably his campaign, not that this was the only problem he had, but arguably his campaign was sunk by the Roger Humphreys case, and the persistence and the defiance of Governor Blanton to not step back from his commitment to party. You had senior, we'll call them Democrats who were in charge of the National Tennessean, where I used to work, who prevailed on him not to do that. Don't do this. This is crazy for one thing, but it's going to kill the party, and arguably it did for many years. But he didn't recant, and on January 15th, Monday night, the state capitol was right up there, and this late night signing spree, Governor Blanton signed his name to 52 clemencies, including 3 outright pardons, and one of them was for Roger Humphreys. When he about to put his pen to the paper, he came to the Humphreys pardon document last. He was sitting there with Gentry Crowell, who was Secretary of State at the time, who was there because his signature had to be affixed to such documents to be proper. The Correction Commissioner, Murray Henderson, was there. The fourth person in the room was Judge Robert Lillard, who I mentioned earlier as having served with my dad in Metro Council, very distinguished Nashvilleian. And he at this point was the governor's chief legal counsel. He was in that office in part because the governor's previous legal counsel had been arrested 1 month before. In the state capitol, on the ground floor, in his office, with marked $100 bills in his pocket. So, but now we're January 15th, Judge Lillard is there, Commissioner Henderson is there, Judge Crowell is there, and Governor Blanton comes to the Roger Humphreys paperwork. And he puts the pen down and he looks up and he says to Gentry Crowell, well, after after all of this turmoil and all these appeals, don't do this. Governor Blanton says, this takes guts. Gentry Crowell says back to him, well, some people got more guts than brains. Picked the pen up and signed his name. And that lit up the sky. It lit up the sky. Tennessee, we were on ABC News. We were on the CBS News with Walter Cronkite. We were, whatever, name it. We were on national news. The New York Times and the Chicago Tribune and all around, as well as the Tennessean and National Banner and local TV. Well, that set in motion this thing that we're going to read about on what I call the fateful day. This thing that had never happened anywhere before in our country, and it's not happened anywhere since. Wednesday morning, 2 days later, Hal Hardin is in his U.S. Attorney's office at the Federal Court, the Keep Off Building, and he is approached in the hallway by a couple of U.S. Marshals, and they say, what are we going to do about this? He says, well, I don't know what we're going to do about this. That's a state matter with federal officials. I don't know. He's then approached by an FBI agent, a fellow named John Gisler, now retired, lives in North Carolina, who says, oh, well, we got more trouble. We have more trouble. What do you mean? Well, we've been at the Capitol this morning, talked to our informant. One thing I never learned was who was that informant. I talked to 3 FBI agents, and they're pretty good. I mean, even now they wouldn't say it. But maybe somebody's still up there. Probably. And the informant said there's enough. That's good. And remember, this is 2 mornings after the Monday night signing spree of 52. So there's another list coming.
Oh my God.
There's 28 more names, and we understand those are being prepared as we speak right now. When all this was over, Hal Hardin learned, because he saw the documentation, that was exactly right, that this was impossible. So, but back to Wednesday morning, what do you do? What do you do? I'm a U.S. attorney. I'm a federal officer. His boss, the Attorney General of the United States, Griffin Bell, General Bell from Georgia, was his boss. What do? Do I call the boss? It might take him too long to get back to me. I might not get through. Busy guy in D.C. Might not even be in D.C. And the clock was ticking. The clock was ticking. Because once these were signed, as you I'm sure know, in our system, and pretty much in every state, I think, probably every state, a governor's power to pardon is absolute. I mean, it cannot be checked. It cannot be reversed. It's just part of our system. And they knew that if there too much more time was permitted to pass, this next 28 might be out the door. And these were some seriously bad people. I mean, these were who had been, I mean, it had been established. You'll see the names in the book. It had been established that they had been involved in not only in allegations of payoffs. The whole thing was, at the time, was called the clemency for cash scandal. Not only have they been involved, but one in particular had been the subject of a conversation that had been tape recorded in a Memphis motel room taped by the FBI. And this particular person was involved in a specific payoff to a specific member of the governor's staff. And that member of the governor's staff was one of 3, including the chief counsel who had the money in his pocket, who were arrested in 3 different places in a suite on December 15th, a month ago. So they knew this was going to be trouble. The clock was ticking. Something had to be done. And what Hal Hardin did, in many ways, he's one of what I would, 2 heroes in the story. He picked up the phone, and he did not call General Bell, his boss in Washington. He didn't call anybody in the office. He called Lamar Alexander, the Republican. Now, Alexander had, you might say, conveniently been elected governor in the preceding election 3 months before, and was the governor-elect. So there was an available governor-elect. He calls Alexander. They didn't really know each other very well. And said, I need you to consider letting yourself be sworn in 3 days early. Just 3 days later was going to be the official inauguration in the party and the bands and the parades and all that. And I mean, that would be a festive occasion. Alexander had campaigned for maybe 5 years for this crowning moment, this inauguration, completely entitled to having a festive weekend. Family was coming in, a lot of people, bands from 95 counties, been training, to come and be in the parades. And this possibly was going to destroy all that into a contest. And he said that he knew pretty immediately, based on what Hal Hardin said to him, that this would have to happen before the day was out. But what that set in motion was, as the title of the chapter, particular chapter is called The Dance, was this dance through the afternoon, where these other senior, all of them, every one of them Democrats, worked with Alexander and his people through this afternoon of decision. And they came to the decision that we had, this has got to happen. And so about 6 o'clock that night, this scene had happened. Now this is just moments after the swearing in. In fact, the official, the judge who swore him in 3 days early was Chief Justice Joe Henry, Chief of the State Supreme Court. He got up from his recuperation from a heart attack. He came and did this thing. He didn't want to do it, but the fact is none of the rest of them wanted to do it either. And I'll just hold up one example. Someday maybe we can all look at a video of this evening, and there were these, in this scramble among the news media to that event, about 6 p.m. that night, where, as you would expect, interviews of this reporter was trying to find Jiffy Crowell, this reporter was trying to find other people. And Hank Allison, reporter for Channel 5 TV, caught up with Ned McCorder. In case you're wondering, McCorder, in my opinion, is the other hero of this film. And he said, he asked kind of the obvious question. He said, Speaker McCorder, you are a Democrat, and all these people in this room participating in this were mainly Democrats, and what you've done is you have sworn in a Republican. I get frankly a little emotional telling this part of the story because it was so heroic and statesmanlike. He said, and the man you swore in was a Republican, so he's trying to bait him. He was talking about the partisan aspect. And Ned McCorder, his glasses were fogged. He seemed to have emotion. You can see it on the surviving video from Channel 5. Seemed to have this emotion in his face, and he said, and he interrupted Hank Allison. He said, wait, let me just say to you, first I'm a Tennessean. And what we did just now, in my opinion, was what was best for the people. Now, for a very senior Democrat to say those words in that moment, a very senior Democrat, Ned McCorder, who later, became governor himself, who was very close to Jimmy Carter and was very close to Bill Clinton later, to say those words, I think was extraordinary, and it did justice to his office, and I think it did justice to our politics. So I think this story, I hope you'll agree if you can read the book, is trying to capture that, for that reason too. It's not just a good tale. It's not just a great yarn that I had fun writing. It's a good story of how senior leaders from different sides of the political aisle came together in an extraordinary moment and did a thing that none of them wanted to do. And they went down a path for which there was no roadmap. And they figured it out. A colleague, one of my interviews was with Charlie Trost, who was an attorney in Nashville for Commissioner of Revenue under Bredesen. He was very close to Bill Leach, and I was chiefly interviewing Charlie Trost, as I did others, to get a sense of the character and the story of Attorney General Bill Leach, who had died before I was able to start this project. And Charlie Trost, I said, so what do you think, how did they finally get to the conclusion? Bill Leach was certainly a leader in that process, in that dance of the afternoon. And he says, I think what they did was they found the law. They found the law. it was not clear what they should do in this situation, because this was extraordinary. We have our state constitution, we have our statutes, and of course, as the attorneys in the room know better than I do, sometimes there's vacancy, and sometimes there's ambiguity. And so one of the many reasons that we have judges and we have that process is to divine what was meant, what was intended. And so Charlie Trost says, I think what they did was define the law. And what they also found, in my opinion, was a great study in the importance of bipartisanship and putting down your partisan labels when crisis comes. And I hope you will agree it's a pretty good story. Thank you.